Welcome back to the Stage Podcast. Earlier this week on the Vibe Shift Podcast, we explored a recognition that is often spoken only in silence. A recognition that doesn't usually arrive during moments of failure. It often arrives during moments of apparent success. After the promotion, after raising a family, after building a career, after becoming dependable, after becoming respected, after becoming everything everyone else seemed to need. And somewhere within that life, a quiet question begins to emerge. Sometimes while driving home from work, sometimes while standing in the shower, sometimes while watching children grow older, sometimes while sitting alone after everyone else has gone to bed. It is rarely loud. It almost never demands attention. It simply appears. I barely recognize the person I become. Or perhaps even more honestly, I don't remember when I stopped being me. If you've ever experienced that recognition, I want you to notice something before we go any further. The very fact that you can recognize the distance between who you are today and who you once experienced yourself to be means something remarkable. There is still something within you that remembers. That remembering matters because it tells us that your authentic self hasn't disappeared. If it had, there would be no recognition at all. There would simply be unconscious living. Instead, awareness has begun gently tapping on the door, not to condemn you, not to tell you you failed, but to invite you into one of the most compassionate questions you've ever asked yourself. How did this happen? Not what's wrong with me, not how do I fix myself, but how did I gradually lose conscious relationship with myself? That is the question beneath today's conversation. The drift no one notices. When people imagine losing themselves, they often imagine dramatic moments, a crisis, a tragedy, a devastating mistake. But that's rarely how it happens. Identity almost never changes through one catastrophic event. It changes through ordinary Tuesdays, through thousands of tiny adaptations that seem completely reasonable in the moment. You learn to become dependable, then indispensable, then responsible for everyone's emotional stability. You learn to become productive, then high-performing, then unable to rest without feeling guilty. You learn to become successful, then identified by your success, then unable to imagine who you are without achieving something. None of those transitions happen overnight. Each one appears harmless, even admirable. In fact, most of them are rewarded. Organizations reward them. Families often depend upon them. Society applauds them. The world calls them maturity, leadership, responsibility, commitment. And many of those qualities are beautiful expressions of human character. The difficulty isn't that we become responsible. The difficulty is that somewhere along the way we stop asking ourselves whether responsibility has quietly replaced relationship. Relationship with our own heart, relationship with our own body, relationship with our own inner knowing, relationship with the quiet awareness that once guided us before life became so full. Identity is built through repetition. One of the greatest misunderstandings about identity is believing that it is something we consciously choose. Much of identity isn't chosen. It is practiced, repeated, reinforced. Imagine a path through the forest. The first time someone walks it, almost nothing changes. The second time, still very little. But after thousands of journeys, a well-worn trail begins to appear. Eventually, the path becomes so familiar that no one questions whether another route even exists. The human mind develops in much the same way. Every repeated thought strengthens a pathway. Every repeated emotional response becomes easier to access. Every repeated behavior gradually becomes experienced as who I am. Notice how often we say things like, I'm just the responsible one. I'm the one everyone depends upon. I'm the strong one. I'm the fixer. I'm the achiever. I'm the caretaker. I'm the one who always keeps it together. Perhaps those aren't identities. Perhaps they are simply the paths we've walked most often. And perhaps awareness isn't asking us to destroy those paths. Perhaps awareness is simply inviting us to remember that they aren't the whole forest. The most compassionate realization. This may be one of the most healing ideas we explore today. You didn't wake up one morning and decide to become someone you barely recognized. You adapted, because adaptation is what human beings do. You adapted to survive, to belong, to succeed, to protect people you loved, to meet expectations, to fulfill responsibilities. There is compassion in seeing that. Because when we understand that adaptation was often an act of love or survival, we stop turning our history into evidence against ourselves. Awareness changes the conversation. Instead of asking, why did I become this? We begin asking, what was I trying to protect? Instead of asking, how did I fail? We begin asking, what part of me was patiently waiting beneath all of this? That question changes everything because it shifts us away from self-judgment and towards self-remembrance. A gentle invitation. Before we continue into part 2, I'd like to leave you with something to quietly carry throughout the rest of the day. You don't have to answer these questions immediately. Simply notice what arises within you. Sometimes awareness begins not with answers, but with the willingness to ask better questions. Reflection questions for part 1. Reflection question number 1. When was the last time I genuinely felt like myself? Not the version of me that performs, provides, or accomplishes, but simply myself. Reflection question number 2. Which roles in my life have become so familiar that I sometimes mistake them for my identity? Reflection question number 3. What expectations have I accepted without ever asking whether they truly belong to me? Reflection question number 4. Where in my life have I been adapting out of love or survival rather than conscious choice? Reflection question number 5. If my authentic self has never disappeared, what quiet evidence have I already noticed that suggests it is gently calling me home? And reflection question number 6. What would it feel like to spend less energy becoming someone and more energy remembering who I have always been? Transition to part 2. In part 2, we'll go even deeper, not by examining the roles we play, but by exploring the architecture of the mind itself. Together, we'll discover how the mind naturally constructs identity through repetition, memory, and belonging, and why awareness doesn't ask us to erase our story. Instead, it invites us to see that beneath every role, every achievement, and every adaptation is a presence that has remained unchanged all along. That is where the journey of remembering truly begins. Part 2. The architecture of identity. How we begin believing we are the roles we play. In part 1, we explored something that can be both unsettling and deeply compassionate. Most people don't wake up one morning and suddenly lose conscious relationship with themselves. Instead, they drift. Not because they are weak, not because they failed, but because the human mind is remarkably adaptive. Today, I'd like to go even deeper. Because once we understand how identity is constructed, we can begin to understand why remembering ourselves often feels so difficult. Not impossible, simply difficult. And perhaps the most liberating realization of all is this: the mind is not trying to imprison you, it is trying to protect you. The challenge is that what protects us in one season of life can quietly limit us in another. Understanding that changes everything. The mind was designed to help you belong. Before we ever learned who we were, we learned how to belong. As children, belonging isn't simply comforting, it is survival. Long before we possessed the ability to reason abstractly, our nervous systems were already learning. They were asking questions we could not yet put into words. What makes the people around me smile? What disappoints them? When do I feel accepted? When do I feel safe? When do I receive affection? When do I feel invisible? Notice that none of these are philosophical questions. They are relational questions. The young mind is constantly gathering information about what creates connection and what threatens it. Without realizing it, we begin organizing ourselves around those discoveries. Perhaps we become the responsible one because responsibility brought approval. Perhaps we became the peacemaker because conflict felt dangerous. Perhaps we became the achiever because accomplishment attracted love and attention. Perhaps we became endlessly helpful because usefulness reduced the possibility of rejection. None of these adaptations are signs of dysfunction. They are signs of extraordinary intelligence. The human organism is remarkably creative in learning how to belong. The difficulty begins when strategies that once helped us survive become identities we no longer question. The difference between identity and awareness. This is one of the most important distinctions we can make. Identity answers the question, who have I learned myself to be? Awareness asks an entirely different question. Who is noticing all of that? Think about that for a moment. You can observe your thoughts, which means you are not identical to every thought. You can observe your emotions, which means your emotions are real experiences, but they are not the totality of who you are. You can observe your professional role, you can observe your successes, you can observe your disappointments, you can even observe the stories you've been telling yourself for years. Something within you is capable of witnessing all of those experiences. That witnessing presence is remarkably quiet. It doesn't compete, it doesn't force, it doesn't demand attention, it simply remains steady, patient, available. Throughout every season of your life, perhaps this is why moments of profound stillness often feel strangely familiar, not because something new has appeared, but because for a brief moment all of the noise settles enough for us to notice who has been present all along. Performance slowly replaces presence. Many of us spent decades becoming exceptionally skilled at performance. Performance isn't pretending. It is the simple ability to function within the expectations of a particular environment. At work, we perform leadership. At home, we perform responsibility. Among friends, we perform familiarity. Within our families, we often perform versions of ourselves that have existed for decades. Again, none of this is inherently unhealthy. Roles are a part of being human. The challenge arises when we become so identified with performing those roles that we lose the capacity to simply be. Presence requires nothing to prove. Performance almost always does. Presence asks, what is true in this moment? Performance asks, what is expected of me? Presence listens inward. Performance primarily listens outward. Presence creates congruence. Performance often creates exhaustion. This is why so many successful people eventually experience profound fatigue that sleep alone cannot resolve. It isn't always physical exhaustion. Sometimes it's the exhaustion of maintaining an identity that no longer reflects the deepest truth of who they are. Awareness doesn't fight the mind. One of the greatest misconceptions in the personal growth is the belief that we must somehow defeat the mind. I don't believe that's true. The mind is an extraordinary instrument. It plans, it solves problems, it anticipates, it remembers, it protects. The goal isn't to silence the mind. The goal is to gently restore it to its proper role. A beautiful servant, but a difficult master. Awareness allows us to appreciate the mind without becoming imprisoned by every conclusion it reaches. It allows us to notice fear without automatically obeying it, to notice ambition without becoming consumed by it, to notice comparison without allowing comparison to define our worth. That is not a battle. It's a relationship. And like every healthy relationship, it begins with listening. Remembering is different than reinventing. Perhaps this is the deepest insight of today's conversation. Transformation is often described as becoming someone new. I wonder if that language has unintentionally made the journey more difficult. What if transformation isn't primarily about reinvention? What if it's about remembrance? Think about that possibility. The qualities you most long to embody: peace, curiosity, presence, compassion, authenticity. They may not need to be manufactured. They may simply need room to emerge. Just as the sun doesn't disappear behind the clouds, your authentic nature doesn't disappear beneath conditioning. It becomes temporarily obscured. Awareness doesn't create the sun, it simply helps the clouds pass. This is why awareness feels less like construction and more like coming home. A gentle pause. As you've been listening today, you may have noticed moments where your own story quietly surfaced. Perhaps a memory, perhaps a role you carried for years, perhaps a subtle realization that you've been measuring yourself through expectations that no longer fit. If so, don't rush past those moments. Awareness rarely shouts. It usually whispers, and the whispers are often where the deepest transformation begins. Reflection questions for part 2. Take a few moments to sit quietly with these questions. Resist the urge to answer them intellectually. Instead, allow them to settle gently into your awareness and notice what arises over the coming hours or days. Reflection question number 1. Which role in my life has become so familiar that I rarely notice I'm playing it? How long have I carried that role? Who first needed me to become that person? Does it still reflect who I truly am today? Reflection question number 2. When do I feel most alive, peaceful, or deeply myself? What am I doing? Who am I with? What is absent in those moments that is usually present in my everyday life? Reflection question number 3. In what areas of my life have I confused being needed with being loved, or being productive with being worthy? How have those beliefs shaped the way I live? What have they asked me to sacrifice? Reflection question number 4. If I stop trying to prove my value for just one day, what emotions do I imagine would arise? Relief? Fear? Freedom? Uncertainty? What might those emotions be trying to teach me? Reflection question number 5. What quiet wisdom has been patiently waiting beneath the noise of all my responsibilities, ambitions, and expectations? Have I been giving it enough space to be heard? And reflection question number 6. If awareness is not asking me to become someone new, but simply to remember who I've always been, what is one small way I can begin honoring that remembrance today? Transition to part 3. In our final part, we'll explore what it actually looks like to live from the place of remembrance. We'll discover that awakening isn't a dramatic escape from ordinary life. It is the gentle return to it with new eyes. We'll explore why authenticity isn't something we achieve, but something we practice, one conscious choice at a time. And we'll see how the life that once felt fragmented begins to move toward a deeper sense of congruence. Not because our circumstances have changed, but because our relationship with ourself has. Part 3. Remembering yourself is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning of living. Over the course of this conversation, we've explored something that many of us have experienced, but few of us have ever been taught to understand. We recognize that identity often drifts quietly, not because we make one catastrophic decision, but because we've spent years adapting. We've explored how the mind constructs identities through repetition, belonging, responsibility, achievement, and survival. And perhaps most importantly, we've discovered that awareness is not asking us to become someone new. It is inviting us to remember. But this raises one final question. Now what? What happens after awareness? What happens after we recognize the drift? What happens after you begin remembering that beneath every role you've played, there was always been something deeper, something quieter, something that remained unchanged? This is where many people unknowingly return to the old paradigm. They believe awareness is another project, another goal, another mountain to climb, another version of themselves they need to create. But awareness doesn't ask us to manufacture another identity. It asks us to begin living from the deepest truth of who we already discovered. That is a profoundly different way of living. Living from remembering rather than performance. For much of our lives, we have been taught to ask questions like, what should I do? How do I become more successful? How do I improve myself? How do I become more productive? Those questions certainly have their place, but awareness slowly begins asking different questions. Not what should I become, but what is true right now. Not how do I earn my worth, but what would someone who already knows their worth choose in this moment? Not what will impress others, but what allows me to remain in relationship with myself? Those questions begin changing everything because life gradually shifts from performance to congruence. Congruence is one of the most beautiful words I know. It simply means that what you believe, what you value, what you say, and how you live begin moving into alignment. Not perfectly, but honestly. Congruence doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for sincerity. Every time you choose what is deeply true over what is merely expected, congruence quietly grows. And with it comes something many people have been seeking for years. Not certainty, peace. The courage to live without constant self-abandonment. Perhaps one of the quietest forms of suffering is something we rarely name. Self-abandonment. Not dramatic abandonment, not intentional abandonment, but the countless moments we quietly leave ourselves behind in order to maintain approval, avoid conflict, meet expectations, or preserve an image we've worked hard to build. Sometimes we say yes when our heart has already whispered no. Sometimes we remain silent when something essentially longs to be spoken. Sometimes we continue carrying responsibilities that no longer belong to us simply because we have carried them for so long that we cannot imagine setting them down. Over time, these moments accumulate, not because we lack integrity, but because we slowly forget that we, too, belong in the decisions we make. Awareness gently interrupts that pattern. It doesn't demand rebellion. It doesn't ask us to reject our responsibility. It simply asks us to stop disappearing from our own lives. Imagine how different your days might feel if before every important decision you quietly asked yourself, can I make this choice without leaving myself behind? That single question has the potential to reshape an entire life. The authentic self has been patient. One of the most comforting realizations on this journey is recognizing that your authentic self has never been impatient with you. It has never criticized you for adapting. It has never condemned you for surviving. It has never judged you to become the person you believed you needed to become. It has simply waited, patiently, quietly, like the sky waiting behind the clouds. The clouds never became the sky. They simply obscured it for a while. Likewise, the identities we've accumulated over the lifetime are not mistakes. They are experiences, teachers, expressions of different seasons of our lives. Some of those identities protected us. Some helped us succeed. Some helped us belong. We don't need to hate them. We simply don't need to mistake them for the whole truth. Awareness allows us to thank those identities for carrying us this far, while gently recognizing that they are no longer the only way we know ourselves. That is not rejection. That is integration. A life of remembering. I believe remembering is not a destination we eventually reach. It is a way of living. Every morning, life quietly asks us, will you remember today? Will you remember that your worth was never dependent upon your productivity? Will you remember that your value cannot be increased by achievement or diminished by disappointment? Will you remember that beneath every title, every success, every failure, every role, and every expectation is a presence that has remained beautifully unchanged? Will you remember to listen before reacting, to notice before judging, to become curious before becoming critical? Will you remember that awareness isn't asking you to perform a better life? It is inviting you to participate more fully in the one that is already unfolding. Perhaps that is what transformation has always been. Not becoming extraordinary, but becoming intimately present with the extraordinary life that has been quietly waiting beneath the noise. Closing reflection. If there is one hope I have for you after today's conversation, it is not that you leave with all the answers. It is that you leave with a greater compassion for yourself, because the person you have become was never your enemy. That person was doing the very best they could with the awareness they had at the time. Now awareness is expanding, and with expansion comes a beautiful invitation, not to erase your past, not to reject your story, but to carry it with greater wisdom, greater gentleness, and greater love. Perhaps you haven't been lost at all. Perhaps you've simply been waiting for the moment when you would finally remember the person who has been quietly walking beside you all along. And perhaps that moment is now. Reflection questions. As we close this week's conversation, allow these questions to accompany you over the coming days. Don't rush to answer them. Let them become companions rather than assignments. Reflection question number 1. What parts of myself have remained unchanged beneath every season of my life? What qualities have quietly endured through success and failure, certainty and uncertainty, joy and hardship? Reflection question number 2. Where in my life have I still confused who I am with what I do? If those roles changed tomorrow, what would still remain true about me? Reflection question number 3. What would it look like to make one decision this week without abandoning my own inner knowing? How might that decision feel different from the choices driven by fear, obligation, or the need for approval? Reflection question number 4. Which identities have faithfully served me, and which ones am I now ready to thank and gently release? Can I honor the role they played without believing I must carry them forward forever? Reflection question number 5. If I truly believed my authentic self had never been lost, how would that change the way I speak to myself today? Would there be more patience, more compassion, more curiosity? And reflection question number 6. 1 year from now, what would it mean to say, I know myself more deeply than I ever have before? What quiet practices of awareness, presence, and honesty would help make that statement true? Closing. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Stage Podcast. If today's conversation resonated with you, I'd encourage you not to stop at understanding the ideas. Transformation deepens through reflection and practice. This week's featured companion experience is VSP number 6, I Don't Feel Like Myself Anymore. While today's episode explored why we gradually lose conscious relationship with ourselves, VSP number 6 is designed to help you begin the journey back. Together we explore how to remember who we truly are, recognize the identities you've unconsciously built, release the ones that no longer serve you, reconnect with your authentic self, and begin returning home to yourself, one gentle step at a time. If you found yourself quietly thinking, I don't feel like myself anymore, this experience was created for you. You'll find VSP number 6 along with the growing VibeShift Core Problems library by visiting the link in the show notes. Every resource in the library begins with a real human experience, one you may already recognize in yourself, and offers a guided path from awareness to alignment to transformation. And don't forget to join us for this Friday for the new VibeShift blog, where we'll continue expanding this week's conversation and explore practical ways to live from remembrance rather than performance. At VibeShift, we believe awareness is where transformation begins. Every recognition is an invitation. Every moment of awareness creates the possibility of alignment. And every step taken in alignment becomes part of the life that feels incredibly authentic. Until next time, keep noticing, keep remembering, keep becoming, because the life you've been searching for may not be somewhere ahead of you. It may simply be waiting beneath everything you've learned to believe you had to be. This is VibeShift. Awareness, alignment, transformation.